Hello everyone, how's it going? And welcome to my Wild Rift tier list for patch 4.3c. In the most recent patch, we saw a lot of nerfs to some really strong champions like Vladimir, Annie, and Ornn. But then also we saw some really crazy buffs to champions like Samira again, and also Lee Sin again for multiple patches in a row. So I've updated my tier list. I'm going to go through every single role for you and let you know what the best champions to play at the moment in the current meta. But before we get into the tier list, I'm just going to let you all know that I'm running a giveaway on this video. I will be giving away one random skin chest. So all you have to do is subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment down below. I'd love to know what success you've had on some champions recently, or maybe let me know what champions you think deserve to be higher or lower in the tier list once you watch the video. But let's head straight into this. So first up, we have the Baron lane. I think the Baron lane still has a lot of great champions that you can play. There's not really too many changes in the Baron lane. Some movements up and movement down here and there, nothing too crazy to actually shout about. The big champions to talk about in this patch though is Ornn. Ornn received another nerf. This is the second or third patch in a row now that Ornn has received a nerf, but Ornn is still a great champion. He's still the best tank to play in the Baron lane, not only because he's still super tanky even though his tank stacks from his passive did get nerfed, but also because of the crowd control that he offers, and also because of his passive allowing him to craft items wherever he wants to on the map. And you could do this as many times as possible. So once you're farming in the lane, or once you're farming during a team fight or something like that, if you want to buy an item, you can craft an item wherever you want to, and you can also give that over to an ally every so often. That just by itself just still makes Ornn very strong. And as I said, he's still tanky and he still offers a lot of crowd control. But in the Baron lane, you still have many different champions and many different play styles that you can play. Champions like Jax and Fiora are still great split pushers to play in the Baron lane. Fairly weakish early game, but once they come online, once you get 2 or 3 items, you can just split push and no one will be able to defeat you in the Baron lane. Early game bruisers like Renekton and Aatrox, both these champions still very strong. Assassins like Akali is still really good. You can play bruisers like Garen and Camille. AP champions like Gwen. All these champions still work very well. Just depends on your playstyle and what champions you are up against. S tier as well, all these champions I'll still recommend. I don't think there's any champions here that I would say don't play, because all these champions will have great impacts. Whether you're playing a tank like Malphite, which still has a very impactful ultimate, bruisers like Set, Irelia, Riven are still very strong. So any champion there is all good. In the A tier, we do have Teemo. Teemo received a pretty nice buff actually in the most recent patch to both his passive and also his ultimate damage. Was already a very annoying champion to deal with in the Baron lane because he's a ranged champion. He has the blind effect, which makes it difficult to play against him. And also, most of the time, range versus melee matchups will always benefit the ranged champion in the early game, unless the melee champion, you play it very well and you work towards that, minion aggro and just work towards that, pretty much perfectly and just engage at the right time. But most of the time it's very difficult to actually deal with Teemo in the early game. Now with the extra damage that his passive does and also the extra damage that his ultimate does, it makes him a little bit more impactful during the mid and late game. I don't think he's still as impactful as other champions above him in the mid and late game, because he doesn't really have any crowd control or anything. You just put shrooms around and just hope they walk over it. But other than that, he can still be a pretty decent champion. Vladimir received a pretty big nerf in the most recent patch. You'll see that Vladimir is A tier in the Baron lane, but S tier in the mid lane. I think that Vladimir in the Baron lane just doesn't have that great of a matchups, and it's really hard to bully most of these champions in the early game, because if you get jumped on in the early game as Vladimir, you can get put under quite a lot of pressure, and it's very difficult to come up against these split push champions that either build a lot of tankiness or build hole breaker. That's why it can be very difficult at times, but Vladimir can still work in the Baron lane. You can still make him work from time to time. But some champions here are still pretty decent. Kennen, Pantheon, got Volibear, Mundo, all these champions are pretty decent. And then when you come down to the B and C tier, this is where champions I feel like are not really that good at all. Champions like Nasus takes way too long to come online. You don't really do anything in the early game at all. You just sit there, farm your first ability, and hope you can get to a point where you can one-shot everyone on the map, which is going to be very difficult. Trendmere, even though he did receive some buffs, I don't think his buffs are going to be enough. I think he's still sitting pretty low on the tier list because he's just not a very good champion. Olaf as well, still not that great. Singed, okay, not that bad. Kale can be good if you get to level 15, but it's just getting to that point, which is very difficult. And Graves isn't really a Baron laner anymore. He just struggles a lot. He doesn't really work that well with Hullbreaker anymore, because ranged champions with Hullbreaker are just not as good as what they were before. So that's pretty much everything in the Baron lane. Like I said, not really many changes, and you can still play a lot of champions. Still play your champions that maybe you always wanted to play. In the jungle, a few champions that I've moved from S+ tier down to S tier, and the reason for that is I was thinking to myself, what are the best champions, and what are the champions that I would recommend for you to play to be able to climb? Because I think jungle, most people would say, is the most impactful role, because you can be anywhere on the map at any point. You can gank any lane, you can influence any lane. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to do that, and this is why most of the time junglers do get blamed in solo queue, even though most of the time it's not really their fault, because someone just dies 1v1 in a Baron lane, they think it's the jungler's fault, and then they just start blaming the jungler, even though they died in a 1v1 anyway, which should have never happened. But that's why junglers just in general very impactful. And I was thinking what are the best junglers to play, and every single champion in the S+ tier are great. I think the only question mark, if anything, is Wukong. But I still think he has so much impact. He has so much crowd control. He has a lot of sustain. He's very difficult to play against. He can clear the jungle very quickly, so he's still very good. But in terms of the other champions, all these other champions, Aatrox, Kha'Zix, Diana, Evelynn, Shadow Assassin Kayn, and also Lee Sin are great carry junglers to play. And that's kind of where the meta is at the moment, is a lot of junglers are just carry assassins or just carry bruisers in general, like Lee Sin and Aatrox. Obviously, Lee Sin, as I mentioned, received a huge massive buff in the most recent patch. His ultimate base damage, his cooldowns across the board got lowered, and he is in a great spot right now. If you saw my video yesterday, you would have seen how great Lee Sin is now as a champion. Definitely a champion to try out. He still is a little bit difficult to play, but still, I couldn't miss putting him out in the S+ tier. You know, champions like Shadow Assassin Kayn is still very good because he's a very strong assassin. Evelynn, Diana, Kha'Zix, yeah, Aatrox as well, still very good. But in the S tier, all these champions can still work very well. Champions like Volibear still does a lot of damage and is still super tanky and very difficult to kill. You can always go with him. Zed is still really good as another assassin in the jungle. Echo as well. Twitch is still pretty annoying to play against, even though he did get nerfed a few patches ago. Yone, if you can get to like 2 or 3 items, is still pretty good. Like I said, there's many different champions you can play here. Jarvan for the early game ganks, and there's a lot of great impactful champions. And to be honest, A tier as well also has a few champions that can work, but can also be a little bit difficult at the same time. I actually think there's quite a few champions in the A tier that could maybe move up. You know, champions like Pantheon. I think Pantheon now with First Strike and how much burst damage you can do with Pantheon, you could sometimes 100 to 0 someone with your second ability, your empowered second ability, and then also your first ability afterwards. You do a lot of damage with Pantheon, but it's just sometimes he can be a little bit difficult, and sometimes you can get CC'd, and he is very squishy, so he can get, you know, countered very easily. Shyvana can still work, but farming junglers are just not that great at the moment. These assassin junglers that gank a lot are just way too strong, and that's why champions like Shyvana and also Nunu as well are just not that great. You know, tank junglers in general are just not that great at the moment, because when you're playing against these carry assassin junglers, by the time they gank lanes, they get more powerful. You're just sitting there on tank Nunu trying to build tank items and trying to survive, but you still get one shot by Shadow Assassin Kayn. So it can be very difficult. That's why champions like, you know, Nunu has moved down, Shen's moved down. Obviously you got Fizz here. I think Fizz is probably one of the weaker in terms of assassin junglers, but you can still make Fizz work if you want to. Rengar and Pantheon, as I mentioned, can still work, but they're just a little bit more difficult to execute. B tier, some of the other champions again that are kind of just fallen out of place really. Morgana just doesn't really get played in jungle anymore. Lilia can work, but again, because we're in a, you know, assassin meta and carry jungle meta, most of these champions are going to struggle. You know, Mumu, Rammus, Dr. Mundo, and then even below as well, champions like Master Yi, Warwick, and Tryndamere. These are just the worst of the worst at the moment. These champions just won't have any impact at all. And if you, say for example, you have a Warwick jungle against someone like an Aatrox jungle or a Kha'Zix, there's such a big difference in terms of champion gap already before the game even starts. As yet, I wouldn't recommend anyone in the C tier, but everyone above, I mean, maybe not the B tier, but everyone above, they still work out pretty well. Mid lane, again, some champions have moved around here and there. Ahri is a champion that I think a few people don't really rate that well, but I think Ari in general, especially after the buffs as well, I think even before the buffs, I think Ori is pretty decent. I think she's a very safe champion to play in the mid lane. She has great pick potential. She has great burst potential as well. Yes, she doesn't do as much damage as like an assassin, like potentially, you know, Zoe or even Zed, even though Zoe's not really an assassin, but you don't do as much burst damage as these champions. But it's that mobility and that kind of ease of play with Ari, which is why I think she deserves to be an S+ tier. And obviously after the boss as well, it means that, you know, Ari is in a pretty good spot again. Again, you know, champions like Yone is still really good in the mid lane. You could just make a lot more impact in the mid lane compared to jungle, because with jungle you just have to kind of farm and just wait until you get a few items. But with mid lane Yone, you can try and make a few plays. Assassins like Akali and Zed is still very strong. But then you still have mages, you know, Zoe's still really good, Vex is still really good, Ari. You still have AD carry mid laners like Lucian, Kai'Sa, Corki. All three of these are still great to play in the mid lane. Twisted Fate has some interesting builds recently. I might need to go back and change the build on the website for Twisted Fate, but I've seen a lot of success with Twisted Fate with First Strike and Nash's Tooth as the first item, going for that more on-hit attack speed Twisted Fate build. So maybe I have to give that a try myself and see, you know, whether I should change it. Orianna's still really good. Champions like Jace is still very strong as well. You know, in general, there are a lot of champions in the S tier that I would still recommend. Karma's still really good, even though I moved her down. She's still great in terms of shielding and a lot of poke damage. But I think the problem with just control mages in general is that when you come up against these assassins or these heavy burst mages, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult. You know, champions like Orianna and Karma are quite difficult because they don't have a crazy amount of burst damage, whereas like Zoe, Ari, Vex, they have a crazy amount of burst damage and crowd control that can make a huge difference in 100-0 someone. As I mentioned, Vladimir, I still think Vladimir deserves to be in the S tier. I don't think he's near enough as broken as what he was before. He received some heavy nerfs. I was tempted to move him down into the A tier, but I still think Vladimir can make a lot of great plays and he still has a lot of potential in the game to carry. And I still think he can be very strong, but he's not as good as, you know, S+ tier as what he was before. Champions A tier still has quite a few good champions. Obviously, Annie now has moved all the way down to the A tier. I think Annie got hit the worst in this patch. Annie got hit a lot with every single ability getting nerfed and even the passive getting nerfed as well. So I definitely don't think Annie is near enough as strong as what she was before, but that's deserved. You know, Annie and Vladimir were two of the strongest champions in the entire game, so no surprise there that both these champions do get nerfed quite did get nerfed quite a bit in the most recent patch. But they're still both champions that you can play. It just maybe you won't be as broken as before. Lux is still fairly decent. You know, if you play First Strike Lux mid lane, you can still have a great impact. Galio Fizz is still pretty good. Again, when it comes down to the B and the C tier, these are champions that I wouldn't really recommend. You can maybe still carry with them, but they're just not as great as the other champions. You know, champions like Morgana mid, even after the buff, she's not that great. Aurelion Soul is very difficult to execute. Brand as well, Seraphine, Singed, and obviously Kale. But everyone from like A and above, I would pretty much recommend. Maybe not the champions in A tier, maybe S and above, but 80 champions can still work. You know, I've seen Akshan work, I've seen Lux work, I've seen Fizz still work, so these champions still work fairly well. AD carry, a few changes here and there for the AD carry tier list, for dual lane tier list. Only 3 champions now in the S+ tier. Kai'Sa still insanely strong with her hybrid build. Tristana is still very good. Ezreal still a super safe AD carry to play down in the dual lane. But Jhin has moved down into the S tier. He did get hit pretty hard by a nerf. I think the force shot was one of the big ways that you can win lane with Jhin and also do a lot of damage when it comes to team fight. That being nerfed by quite a lot of damage has definitely hurt Jhin a lot during the laning phase and also during the later stages of the game. But then you have another champion that's moved up into the S tier, which is Samira. I think Samira is a great champion now. I've been playing a bunch of Samira. You probably would have seen my gameplay a few days ago. I think Samira is in a great spot after the buffs. She is still very difficult to play. I do have to warn you that she is very difficult to play. You do have to make sure that you understand her strengths and weaknesses, when to go in, when to use your combos, when to use your abilities, because getting up to that S rank and using your ultimate at the right time is the most important thing for Samira to be able to get, you know, the potential of a quadra-kill or even a pentakill. But I think after the buff, she's great. She's really, really good. Her first ability actually feels like it does damage now in the early game, so it's still great. But there's still, you know, quite a lot of champions in the S tier that are still really good. Xayah, Varus, Caitlyn, Lucian, Corki, Zeri, Vayne. I'm not too sure if Vayne should move down into A tier. Vayne got a pretty heavy nerf, to be honest with you. The attack speed per level is pretty big. I think the cooldown on the Condemn, the third ability, means that she can't play as aggressive as what she did before. She's not going to have her Condemn up as often. I haven't actually played Vayne since the recent changes, so I definitely have to go back, see what she's like, and maybe give her a try again. But I didn't move her down into the A tier just yet because I don't think Vayne deserves to be in the same tier as like Draven, Jinx, and Nyla, because these champions, yes, they can work and they can be very good, but they're just not as good as the champions above. That's why I was like, Vayne is definitely better than the A tier, but not as good as some of the S tier champions. And that's where maybe that like A+ tier can come in. But I haven't, you know, put that back. I think Vayne sitting in the S tier is completely fine. B tier, Twitch, Ashe, and Misfortune, just champions that don't really do too well. Then you have Senna, Akshan down in the C tier. A support as well, again, not that many changes. I think with supports, the big thing with supports right now is enchanters in general, enchanters or champions that work best with Glacial Augment. You can see here, pretty much every single champion has either Glacial Augment or Eri. They're either champions that are enchanters or champions that use Glacial Augment to the best effect. Enchanter supports are still going to dominate the meta though. Soraka, Lux, Yuumi, and Lulu. All these champions have great ways to keep your team alive, to keep your duo queue or even trio queue alive. Great crowd control, great healing, great shielding, overall great champions. But there are a lot of champions in the S tier that you can still carry with. Champions like Pyke, one of the best, if not the best carry supports right now, that you can roam around the map, you can make a difference, do a lot of damage, and make huge plays for your team. But these tanky supports are still very, very good. Thresh, Nautilus, Leona, Rakan as well. You have two different ways of really playing Rakan, whether you want to play AP Rakan or tank Rakan, both still work very well. Nami and Karma are still really good. There's a lot of champions here. I think every champion, the S+ and the S tier, you can play. It just depends on matchup. It depends on your team comp. But just don't fall into the trap of people spamming, we need a tank, because sometimes you don't need a tank at all, because not every game you need a tank. Not every champion needs to be, you know, a tank. Not every team comp needs to have a tank. 80 champions can still work. Champions like Senna can work, you know, still pretty well. Sona can get online after a little while. Ornn can still be pretty good. Galio as well. They're just not as good, and they don't really make full benefit of the Glacial Augment rune compared to the others. Seraphine still is still insanely is still, you know, pretty weak. Brom is still pretty weak. Blitzcrank as well. I think the problem with Brom is that he just doesn't really have a rune to run, a major rune to run now. Blitzcrank, if you land a hook, great. Set, Morgana, just not that great either. But that's pretty much everything. I didn't, like I said, because this was just a small patch, there wasn't really any major changes in general, but there's still a lot of champions to definitely highlight. You can see in all the roles here, you know, all these S+ tier champions at the moment, all the S tier champions, these are all still very strong. And not a lot of champions actually in the C and B tier. As you can see, there's a lot more in like the, you know, S and S+ tier. And I think that just shows how flexible the meta is right now. There are many different champions you can play to carry. As mentioned already, let me know down in the comments on what you think of this tier list, and let me know what champions you will move here and there. But as always, thank you for tuning into the video, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care. Peace.